Hello everyone, welcome back to The World and Psychology. If this is your first time tuning into this podcast, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Jill. Quick introduction for me and why I do this podcast. I'm an undergraduate student studying psychology, and I want to make psychology easier to understand and more accessible for everybody. The World in Psychology is a weekly podcast about psychology and how we can see different aspects of psychology in the real world. This month we've been discussing the seemingly elusive field of cognitive psychology. Today's topic is cognitive psychology in the military. So, put on your comfy pants, grab yourself a cup of tea, and let's talk about psychology. So, today's episode is going to be digging up the secrets of sleep deprivation. And I know you might be thinking to yourself, Jill, how does sleep deprivation really tie into the military more than any other area? And I will get to that, I promise. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to start off with a super basic definition of what cognitive psychology is. Webster Dictionary terms cognitive psychology as being a branch of psychology concerned with mental processes, especially with respect to the internal events occurring between sensory stimulation and the overt expression of behavior. Yeah, I'll have a large spoonful of that word salad, please. So to simplify that into something that's more easily digested, let's just break it down a bit. So cognitive psychology deals with how our brains run our normal mental processes. This can be anything from accessing your memories, be it short-term or long, making sure that you pay attention to your surroundings and the things happening in your life, or even thinking and speaking. I like to remember that psychology generally is focused on how the brain does the thing. Because cognitive psychology can be like, it touches on every aspect of psychology and even some physiology. It's really broad, really cool, kind of a lot to understand. Generally, how the brain does the thing. Now that we have a much more digestible understanding of what cognitive psychology is, let's get started on what it has to do with the military. So, the U.S. military is one of the leading research groups, besides universities, for both medical, technological, and psychological advancements and developments. Members of the military are often subject to situations that are, for lack of a better word, incredibly unique. It is uncommon for military members to go through sleep deprivation training to prepare word salad to prepare them for scenarios that they might experience either at their normal active duty stations or in a deployment setting. This kind of training is important for the military members, but when placed in a chronic setting of sleep deprivation, they can end up with potentially severe physiological and psychological damage. There's also evidence that deployment settings actually might be related to a decrease in cognitive function. Now keep in mind that this is an area that isn't heavily researched, and you should take this with a grain of salt, just like everything that you read in media and everything like that. This study did find a change, albeit a very slight one, between a pre- and post-deployment analysis of cognitive functioning. Now, these findings weren't deemed statistically significant, though, because of the large sample size that that the researchers had access to, because they were using a standardized military-based assessment. So they had an insanely large sample size, and what can happen when you have ridiculously large sample sizes like this your statistics end up getting a little bit skewed one way or the other. So it's important to bear those things in mind when you read these studies. It just kind of, again, grain of salt. Now, there is some speculation that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is to blame for a lot of the changes that are seen in cognition that were observed in the post-deployment analyses. And this is, like, speculated across the board, not just in this one area. With military members being one of the most at risk populations for chronic PTSD, there has been a massive push for reliable treatments for PTSD within the military community. There has been solid support for cognitive behavioral treatments for PTSD for a while. However, research has started to show that cognitive processing therapy might be a better option for treatment. CPT, cognitive processing theory, will typically involve a combination of both cognitive and exposure therapies. CPT will usually focus on the emotions and anxieties that may come from the experienced trauma, and one of the benefits of CPT is that it can be delivered in a group setting. There are so many different treatments that are around for PTSD, but there are treatments like CPT, cognitive processing therapy, that are both effective in the case-by-case settings as well as in the group settings. And those kinds of judgment calls on what treatment's going to work best for what situation should always be left up to the individual and their care providers. So we're going to backtrack a little bit back to sleep deprivation. Now, this is something that most of us can experience at some point in our lives, right? It's not particularly special, so why cover it? And it really doesn't seem interesting or related to psychology at all. I know, sleep deprivation, we get tired and we function slower. There's a lot more to it than just those things. And it's not super interesting because we can just catch up on sleep, right? Like I said, not really all that simple. There's a lot more that goes on in our brains than we realize when we're sleep deprived, and that's kind of the point. Our brains actually end up running on full cylinders when we're sleep deprived because they have to keep us functioning at a seemingly normal level so that we can stay alive. There are a lot of cognitive functions that seem to be unaffected by sleep deprivations, but things like complex decision making seem to be incredibly heavily affected by sleep deprivation. One of the more well-known and well-supported effects of sleep deprivation is that when sleep deprived, most people will end up sacrificing speed for accuracy. AKA, we deal with a slower reaction time as long as we remain accurate in our actions. Now, before you ask me, why does slower reaction times matter in the military if we're still being accurate with our actions? And let me tell you why this could be in certain situations, not all by any means, but why this could end up being potentially deadly. We're going to look at fighter pilots as an example. They have to be able to make split-second decisions and alterations in flight or while completing a flight mission. So do we when we drive. There's an argument there. So do we when we drive. But there's some differences between us driving and a fighter pilot in a war setting flying his plane or her plane. The difference is planes are thousands of feet in the air. And I know that that's an under-exaggeration, but thousands of feet in the air, traveling a few hundred miles an hour faster than cars do. And that's just the, like, baseline basics of it. If we were to get into the actual mechanics of every little thing that could possibly go wrong in a plane, we would be here for hours, and none of us have time for that. If you do, cool, good for you. I don't have time for that. So add in one more factor to this example. We're discussing fighter pilots in a war setting. Their mission could involve elimination of a threat. And I'll leave it at that. Don't want to get into the hefty details or possible scenarios. We're going to leave it there. Being able to make quick and accurate decisions in these situations, in these settings, as fighter pilots is absolutely crucial for these members of the military. Sorry for the doom and gloom, but that's why reaction times are important in these situations, more so than they are for us. So having that slower reaction time could end up meaning the difference between life and death on either side. For the pilot, for his target, for the people on the ground below him. It's not something to be thought of lightly, and I know reaction time, but this is something that's, like, important, and this is one of the bigger side effects and most recognized side effects of sleep deprivation. We're gonna move on to a little bit lighter area of sleep deprivation that I'm gonna call the things that I found most interesting while I was researching this topic. So one of the coolest things that I found was that there's actually changes in our oculomotor functions. A little bit of a word salad there. Big word, big definition. But motor functions are things like pupil dilation and constriction speed and saccade velocity. So saccade velocity is how quickly our eyes travel across chunks of our vision. So to give you an actual visual of what a saccade is, I'm gonna show you, but I'm also gonna give you instructions on how to go see this on your own, for your own knowledge. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna go up to a mirror, or you're gonna set your phone up, and you're gonna record yourself like I am. And what I want you to do is try to move your eyes slowly from one corner of your field of vision to the other without stopping. So you're going to try to make your eyes go across your field of vision instead of doing this thing. Okay? Go ahead and pause the video if you want to and try it afterwards. It's up to you. It's your life. But I'm going to go ahead and show you guys real quick what I'm talking about. Okay? So I'm going to start over here. And then I'm going to come back. Now when I blinked, I'll go one more time. Did you see how my eyes kind of stopped and start and stopped, start to go again? That's a saccade. So each little stop and start is a saccade. So the velocity at which those stop starts are happening is actually changing when you're sleep deprived. It goes way down. And it's crazy. So does pupil dilation and constriction speeds. Those slow down with sleep deprivation, meaning you're probably going to find yourself taking slightly longer to adjust to changes in the light setting or processing visual information around you. So when you first wake up in the morning, if you got a really crappy night's sleep, or if you didn't sleep at all and you've been in the dark working on a paper, and then your parents come in, flip on the lights, that moment where you're just like, it's so bright. That's because your brain can't process. And it's taking longer for your pupils to dilate and constrict to adjust to that. So the same thing is happening for saccades. Their velocity slows drastically, meaning it's going to take you longer to shift your visual attention from one point to another. you probably won't notice these changes, but they're there, and that's really cool, in my opinion. Besides the ocular motor changes, the other super interesting thing that I found is that recovery sleep, the time that we spend asleep after we've been sleep deprived, is actually a completely different type of sleep than what we consider our normal sleep. When we're in a recovery sleep state, our sleep efficiency is better, and the amount of REM cycles that we go through is actually higher than normal. But the amount of time spent in stage 1 sleep is lower. Stage 1 sleep is the moments in sleep when we are just barely asleep and can be easily woken up. So if you're a relatively light sleeper like me, it's those moments right when you start dozing off. And you can feel yourself falling asleep to where you're not going to want to wake up if you hear a noise, but you're still going to be able to hear a noise and say, oh, something's happening. Basically, those things combined, we experience a much deeper sleep than usual when we're in a recovery sleep. And this kind of sleep is important in reestablishing our baseline cognitive functions, along with the physiological aspects like the ocular motor changes that I just talked about. And unfortunately, this kind of sleep is not studied as much as you would think it would be because of, despite it being as important as it is. Most studies revolving around sleep deprivation don't include the time period of recovery sleep, so there isn't a ton of evidence on how recovery sleep actually impacts the repair of our impaired cognitive functioning. It's super interesting, and it's definitely something that should be researched further, in my own opinion. I like to know that it's okay that I'm sleeping like the dead. And I think that this has been a really fun topic to discuss and research, and you guys should definitely go and do your own research in this area if it's fascinating to you like it is for me. I know that there are thousands of areas of cognitive psychology, especially in relation to the military, but I chose to focus on sleep deprivation because it is widely relatable outside of the military as well. And as I stated at the beginning of the podcast, and in every episode, my goal is to make psychology in general more understandable and attainable for everybody, not just the people that are studying it and are able to digest the word salad. Now, not as many of us will experience total sleep deprivation like the U.S. military members. That these research studies that I've talked about have focused on. But it's important for us all to realize that sleep deprivation can be a much bigger issue than we think it is. So, to end today's episode, I'd like to challenge you all to get at least 7 hours of sleep every night this week. Big challenge, I know, especially if you're a college student in finals week like I am. If you can't do the 7 hours, try to get to bed before 1 o'clock, especially if you're a college student. All your assignments are due at 11:59 p.m. As always, I'm going to provide the timestamp citations for the research articles I've read this week for this week's topic in the episode description. Remember to fact check and do your own research if you find something interesting and compelling. Goodbye for now. Enjoy your week, and I'll see you next time.